Hi, everybody, and welcome to Week 7's mini lectures. This week we're discussing immigration and urbanization, and I've got 4 mini lectures total, one on immigration, another on urbanization, one on the Montana cities of Butte and Anaconda, and to conclude, an introduction to 2 strains of political thought that attempted to ameliorate some of the issues of late 19th century America. So, to begin our discussion of immigration, let's start with a few statistics. By 1900, 1/3 of the U.S. population was foreign-born, with geographic origins around the world. Between 1880 and 1910, around 17 million immigrants had entered the United States, with upwards of 1,500 immigrants per day at its peak. And between 1820 and 1930, the United States took in 60% of the total population of world's migrants. In the United States, immigration and ideas about race are intertwined and even inseparable. We're going to get more into the history of the pseudoscience behind scientific racism in our reading of Defending the Master Race. But the mass migration to the United States exacerbated tensions over race, while further complicating these ideas about race. Anxious white elites, formerly merely concerned over relations between black, white, and Native Americans, now had to contend with Italians, Greeks, Syrians, Slovenians, Serbians, Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, Spanish, Portuguese, Polish, Armenian, and all of the other ethnicities that make up the mass of humanity, but not that list. For class-conscious elites, these teeming masses signified disease and degeneracy. Many elites questioned whether the U.S. should admit Catholic migrants, as they feared that Catholics could not both swear allegiance to the United States Constitution and to the Pope. Others worried that the national character would change, that the U.S. would no longer be driven by an Anglo-Saxon political tradition and elite, or even that other languages might supersede English as the dominant language. And still others worried that interbreeding between the races would lead to mongrelization of the species into degeneracy. Needless to say, they were quite misguided. Now, moving is a pain. For those of us in our 20s, I'm not included in that list, you've probably moved a few times in your life. After a while, especially in adulthood, all the moves blend together into a string of apartments and shared houses and occasionally couch surfing. Few people actually like moving. Migration, or moving from one place to another, never happens in a vacuum. Scholars of migration point to push and pull factors, or reasons to leave one place and move another. The nifty little hand picture I found offers some ways to think about push and pull migration, based off of social, cultural, economic, and environmental factors. In the late 19th century in the United States, the major pull factor was the mythical, unprecedented thrum of the American industrial economy, with high wages and jobs like copper mining in Butte. If an Eastern European family sent one of their sons to Butte to be a miner, they expected that he would remit some of his wages back to the family in their home country, therefore improving their lot. Associated with this was the availability of free land through the Homestead Act. Whole farming communities from Europe filed claims under the Homestead Act, transporting entire villages to the Upper Plains, and leading to an ethnic tapestry that included German communities, Finns, Swedes, Norwegians, and many others, but also religious minorities. There were also notions of political freedom, which was an attractive idea for a world gripped by despotic regimes. Serfdom and feudalism still existed broadly throughout the world, and violence and economic stagnation crippled many regions. Famines in China killed millions at a time in episodic spats. Pogroms in Eastern Europe targeted Jewish communities. All of this combined was enough to uproot millions from their nations and push them to migrate to a nation-state that welcomed their labor while scorning their inferiority as, quote, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. On January 1, 1892, Annie Moore disembarked from the steamship she had been on for the past 2 weeks. Disembarking was a bit of a process, as she had been down in the steerage compartments, or the lower decks of the ship, where the poor people were able to afford a ticket to the United States. First in class disembarked before steerage and walked swiftly into New York City. And steerage literally refers to the weight of the human bodies in the holds, which kept the ships properly loaded and upright. Without the ballast of human immigrants in the lower decks, the ship would ride even more unsteadily in the harsh North Atlantic winter. Annie and her 2 brothers boarded a barge and were taken out into New York Harbor to Ellis Island. The first and second class passengers filled out some cursory paperwork while on board and were allowed into the U.S. without further screening, as they were seen as being less likely to become a burden on the state, i.e., get in legal trouble, require medical care, trend towards criminality, or breed prolifically. The steerage passengers went to Ellis Island. Annie Moore had come from County Cork, Ireland, along with her 2 younger brothers, aged 15 and 12. She became the first person to be processed at Ellis Island, the U.S. government's immigration processing center in New York Harbor on the Hudson River. She was the first person processed out of a total of 12 million over a half a century. She went through a few hours of processing, including a medical examination, and was released into the United States. She was only 17, but began a life in New York City, living there until she died at age 50. Her story is just the first among millions of immigrants who came through Ellis Island. In that facility, they were measured, categorized, given what was called 6-second physicals, where a physician would look over their body for examination of disease or disability, fingerprinted, deloused, and logged as migrants. The overwhelming majority of immigrants who came through Ellis Island were of European extraction, but often from Southern or Eastern Europe. On the West Coast, another facility operated in a similar manner on Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. If we remember for a second Elliot West's argument in Reconstructing Race, that the West's racial and ethnic heterogeneity complicated the ideas held about race by Anglo-Americans in the East. It was no longer the simple white over black and red racism of the antebellum. Instead, the polyglot of humanity in the West forced a reckoning with Native Americans and people of Hispanic and Asian descent. Tensions over labor and wages were in the forefront. Whites resented Chinese migrants for their hard work ethic and willingness to work for low wages in tough, dangerous jobs, especially mining and railroad construction. All this came to a head with the National 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, designed to prohibit Chinese immigration in the United States, even if the territory had only become the United States a few decades earlier. Much like its East Coast companion, Angel Island was a processing facility. Unlike Ellis Island, Angel Island was also a holding facility, and many Chinese immigrants were forced to prove that they had a husband or father who was a U.S. citizen or be deported back to China. From 1910 to 1940, Chinese immigrants were detained and interrogated at Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco Bay. U.S. officials hoped to deport as many as possible by asking obscure questions about Chinese villages and family histories that immigrants would have trouble answering correctly. Immigrants were detained for weeks, months, sometimes even years. Word got back to China about the prolonged questioning. So many immigrants would try to mentally prepare before even crossing the Pacific Ocean. Additionally, once detained, men and women were housed separately, breaking up families. Detainees spent much of their time in the barracks, languishing between interrogation. The immigrants expressed their fears and frustrations through messages and poems written and carved onto the barrack walls. And they described the disinfection and inspection process as brutal, humiliating, and dehumanizing. These two islands, each situated in the major metropolitan port on its respective coast, reflect the increased surveillance and bureaucratization of the immigration process, but also represent American anxieties about race and immigration. So I want to switch gears here for a sec and discuss some of the structural issues of the American economy and how it tied to immigration. In the late 19th century, the American industry was an incredible force. It could manufacture nearly anything conceivable. Its mines cranked out gold, silver, coal, copper, and other minerals. Blast furnaces produced steel from pig iron at an amazing pace. Farmers grew tons of grain, while ranching operations raised millions of heads of cattle. Lumber operations took their saws to the old-growth forests of the West Coast, producing amazing amounts of lumber, which was shipped around the world. There's Oregon timber in mines in South Africa and Western Australia. Railroads and telegraphs networked the nation and connected the world, eliminating the tyranny of distance and collapsing time. And new steamships left the dry docks to carry goods and people to Europe and Asia and bring migrants back. The American industrial economy boomed. It worked. It produced almost too well. There were two interconnected issues with the high performance of the American industrial economy: overproduction and underconsumption. Factories produced so much stuff that they had problems selling it all, and the American economy could not absorb the surpluses it produced. Part of this was the low wages paid to industrial workers. Yes, they were paid far more than their contemporaries in their home countries. An industrial worker in Pittsburgh's blast furnaces or the mines of Butte made a wage that his brother in Sicily might have only dreamt of. But their relative low wages, in comparison to the overall economy, affected their purchasing power and the overall ability of the U.S. to consume the goods it produced. Even the growing middle class could not purchase enough to absorb the surplus, and the upper class comprised such a small portion of the economy that their purchasing could not even touch the surplus that their own investing drove. Take a manufactured good, such as an automobile, just coming into mass production in the years before World War I. If you were an auto manufacturer, which would you rather do? Sell one car for $10,000, sell 100 cars for $1,000 apiece, or sell 100,000 cars for $100 apiece. Manufacturing for the consumption of the upper class is no way to dispose of industrial mass-produced surplus. The mass of the population and the available consumers are in the middle and lower classes, but their purchasing power was limited in the time by wealth inequality. The American economy had to find an outlet for its surplus production, or supply would dramatically exceed demand, profits would fall, and the economy would crash. The solution, as we'll see in the upcoming weeks, was to secure foreign markets for U.S. goods through the open door policy, the policy of opening foreign markets to U.S. manufacturers and agricultural goods. The prime target for these policies was Asia. Now we'll pick it up in the next mini lecture on urbanization. See you there.